Bacon, eggs, toast, orange juice squeezed by hand, and a kitchen radio playing softly in the background. That was the whole world between 6:30 and 8 in the morning, in a kitchen that smelled like something you have spent the rest of your life trying to get back to. Not the food exactly, though the food was exactly right, but the feeling behind it. The feeling of waking up in a house where someone was already awake before you, already in the kitchen, already making something hot, already thinking about you before you had said a single word. You could smell it before you reached the kitchen. You could smell it from the hallway, or from the top of the stairs, or even on the mornings when the house was small enough and the bacon was thick enough and the frying pan was hot enough. From your bed. It came under the door. It traveled. There was nothing passive about the smell of bacon frying in the early morning in a 1960s American kitchen. It had a direction. It moved through the house the way sunlight moves, with intention, and it pulled you toward it the same way. You got up, not because an alarm told you to, or because the day was already demanding things of you, but because the kitchen was warm and something good was happening in it, and you wanted to be there. Your feet found the floor, cool linoleum in summer, bar boards in older houses. The particular cold of a kitchen floor in October that you don't feel anywhere anymore. That specific morning cold that made the warmth of the stove mean something. There was one sound that meant the day had truly begun. A sound so particular to that era, so tied to a specific object and a specific time of morning, that it is almost extinct now. And if you grew up in a 1960s American home, you heard it every single day and you understood what it meant, the way you understood everything that formed the reliable architecture of your childhood, without analysis, without gratitude. Because you didn't know yet that things you didn't notice were the things most worth noticing. We'll come back to that sound. The kitchen in the morning had its own light. Not quite daylight yet, at 6:30 or 7, especially in the colder months. The overhead light was on, the one with the glass globe that collected dead moths and had to be cleaned twice a year. And it gave the kitchen a particular amber warmth that was different from any other light in the house. Morning kitchen light. If you saw a photograph of it now, you would know immediately what time it was. You would know that somewhere off camera, the table was being set and the stove was on, and someone had already been up for 40 minutes before the rest of the family appeared. That someone, in most American homes of the 1960s, was the mother. She was already dressed, not for the day, not in the clothes she would wear to the grocery store or the PTA meeting, but in a house dress or a robe over her nightgown. Or the house dress she kept on a hook behind the bedroom door and put on without thinking because there was no time before the bacon needed to go in and the coffee needed to be started. She had been in the kitchen long enough that she had already done things you didn't see. She had filled the percolator and set it on the burner. She had laid the strips of bacon in the cast iron skillet. She had taken the butter dish from the refrigerator and set it on the counter to soften. She had gotten out the bread and the jam and the plates. By the time you shuffled in with your eyes still half closed, the kitchen was already in motion, already organized, already smelling exactly like a morning should. Do you remember the way the kitchen smelled when you woke up? Not just the bacon. The bacon was first and loudest, the thing your nose found before anything else. But underneath the bacon was the coffee. The percolator had been going for 15 or 20 minutes by then, and the coffee smell was deepening by the minute, changing from raw and slightly bitter to full and rounded and warm. And it came from the stovetop in a steady, companionable drift that mixed with the bacon and made something that was neither one alone, but both together. And that combination, that specific alchemy of frying pork fat and percolating coffee and a warm oven and a kitchen radio, is the smell of the 1960s American morning, and there is nowhere in the world you can go to find it now. The percolator. This is the sound. The stovetop percolator, the Corningware one, or the Pyrex Flameware version with its clear glass lid and glass knob, or the heavy aluminum one that had been a wedding present and still worked perfectly 15 years later, made a sound that was entirely its own. It started quietly. Water heated at the bottom, rose through the tube, fell through the coffee grounds, began its cycle. For the first few minutes it was almost inaudible. Then the tempo quickened, and the sound became something between a bubble and a knock, rhythmic and insistent. the hot coffee hitting the glass knob at the top with a percussive steadiness that measured the morning in beats. Tock, tock, tock. You haven't heard that sound in decades, but you know it immediately. It is in your body somewhere, below memory, below thought. It means morning. It means warmth. It means that someone turned the stove on before you woke up, which means that someone was thinking about the morning before you were. By the late 1960s, the electric percolator was beginning to appear on kitchen counters. The Sunbeam, the Proctor Silex, the General Electric models in Harvest Gold or Avocado Green that sat on the counter and did the same work without requiring the burner. Practical. Reliable. But the stovetop percolator had a quality the electric ones could not replicate. It was visible. You could watch it. The glass knob showed you the color of the coffee darkening as the minutes passed, showing you the progress, the readiness, the moment when it was strong enough and the heat should be turned down. It was a small performance that happened every morning on the stove, and if you were a child, you watched it sometimes the way you watched small fires, with a comfortable, unfocused attention that was almost meditative. The thing that sat in the middle of every 1960s American breakfast table, year after year, that every family had but nobody thought much about. We'll get there. It's one of those objects so ordinary it became invisible. But it mattered, in ways you'll recognize immediately when we get to it. First, the bacon. Thick-cut bacon from the butcher, in many households of the era, was a different food from what later generations would know from cellophane packages. The butcher cut it to order, and if your mother had a preference, and many of them did, she asked for it thick, and he sliced it accordingly, and it came wrapped in white butcher paper, and it sat in the refrigerator until it was needed, which was every morning in most households, because breakfast without bacon was not quite a complete breakfast. It went into the cast iron skillet, the black one, heavy and almost indestructible, seasoned over years until its surface was nearly non-stick. The skillet that had probably cooked 1,000 pounds of bacon and would cook 1,000 more without complaint. The cast iron skillet had weight to it. A child could not lift it easily, and sometimes a child was allowed to try, and the heaviness of it was surprising every time. And a mother would guide the small hands to the handle and say, "Careful, it's hot," and the child would feel the dense metal warmth radiating up through the cloth pot holder even before the food went in. That skillet is probably still somewhere. In an attic. In a kitchen cabinet of someone now in their 60s or 70s who kept it, because you don't throw away a cast iron skillet. You just don't. Because it belonged to your mother and her mothers before her. And it still works perfectly. And nothing made today is built the way that skillet was built. The bacon went in, and the sound that followed was immediate and entirely satisfying. A hiss and spit as the cold fat met the hot iron, then a deepening sizzle that settled into a steady, comfortable roar that filled the kitchen and said, plainly, something is being made for you. It curled at the edges first. The fat rendered. The color moved from pale pink to tan to the deep brownish red of done, and your mother watched it with the specific attention of someone who had cooked this 10,000 times and still didn't trust it to do the last minute on its own. She would turn it with a fork or with the spatula. Maybe yours had a particular spatula, dark with years of use, the handle worn smooth where her hand had gripped it every morning, the blade slightly warped from years of heat. A tool so specific to her kitchen that it seemed to be an extension of her hand. What did your family's breakfast table look like on a weekday morning? The Formica table. Chrome-edged, almost certainly. Pale yellow or pale pink, or white with a boomerang pattern in gray and turquoise. That was the epitome of mid-century modern in its moment and would become, decades later, the object of nostalgic collectors. That surface was cool to the touch in the morning, the first thing your hands felt when you sat down and pressed them flat on the table, waiting for your plate. Cool and smooth with a faint texture, not quite glossy, clean from the night before, the chrome edge slightly cold, and running all the way around like a border on a map, defining the territory of the kitchen table as a distinct world within the kitchen, the world where the family gathered. The chairs around it were often mismatched in older households, or perfectly matched vinyl and chrome in newer ones, the chrome legs making a specific sound on the linoleum when someone pulled their chair in. A small scrape and settle that happened every morning at exactly the same time and was part of the music of the kitchen. The kitchen radio was always on, not loudly. That's the important thing. It was never dominant. It sat on the counter, or on top of the refrigerator, or on a small shelf above the window, and it played at a volume that was clearly background volume, the volume of something present rather than demanding attention. A morning program from the local AM station, news at the top of the hour, then weather, then a farm report if you were in the Midwest, then music, popular music of the era, or perhaps country, or perhaps the easy listening that was everywhere in the first half of the 60s, the orchestral popular music that sounded like a world without sharp edges, Doris Day, Percy Faith. The morning sounds of 1962 on a kitchen radio in Iowa or Ohio or Virginia or Oregon, turned down low enough that you could hear the bacon sizzling over it, which was the correct volume. That radio was company. It was presence. It meant that the kitchen was not silent, and silence in a morning kitchen has a different quality from the productive, radio-accompanied silence of a kitchen where something good is being made, and the news is on at low volume, and a cup of coffee is within reach. The radio turned the ordinary work of making breakfast into something that felt, without anyone commenting on it, like a moment of civilization, like people taking care of themselves and each other in the most fundamental possible way, with eggs and coffee, and the morning news, and someone at the stove in a house dress, and children in pajamas sitting at the chrome-edged table, and the smell of everything combining into something that was greater than its parts. The eggs came after the bacon, almost always after the bacon, because the bacon fat left in the skillet was where the eggs belonged. A thin slick of it, enough to coat the iron, and the egg cracked directly into it. Your mother cracking it with one hand if she had done this enough years, which she had. The shell splitting cleanly, and the egg falling in whole, the white spreading and hitting the hot fat with a sizzle, entirely different from the bacon's roar, a lighter, more delicate sound. The sound of something fragile meeting heat and holding together. Fried eggs. The white setting from the edges in toward the yolk, going from transparent to opaque in a visible process that was somehow both science and ceremony. The yolk staying soft and orange, if she knew you liked it that way, firm all through, if that was what you preferred, basted with a small spoonful of the hot fat, if that was the house style. Some mornings it was scrambled eggs. That was a different operation. The eggs broken into a bowl first, beaten with a fork or a whisk with a splash of milk, seasoned, poured into the buttered skillet, and moved slowly with the spatula as they cooked, the curds forming and folding, the whole mass going from liquid to softly solid, in a process that required attention and a low heat, and the willingness to pull them off before they were quite done, because they kept cooking on the plate. The best scrambled eggs were slightly undercooked when they left the pan. Every good breakfast cook knew this. Most of them didn't explain it. They just did it. On weekday mornings, it was the stovetop, the skillet. The practiced efficiency of a woman who had made breakfast 365 days a year for as long as she had been a wife and mother, which might have been 15 or 20 or 25 years by the time you were old enough to remember it. She knew exactly how long each thing took. She knew that the toast needed to go down about a minute before the eggs were done, so they'd be ready at the same time. She knew that the coffee would be at its best strength about 18 minutes after she started the percolator. She knew things about breakfast the way craftsmen know their material, not through articulated knowledge, but through thousands of repetitions, through the body's memory of timing and heat and sound. The toaster sat on the counter and was either a Sunbeam or a Toastmaster, chrome-bodied with a particular weight and heft of a well-made small appliance, the slots just wide enough for white bread, which was the bread. Not wheat, not whole grain, not artisan sourdough. White bread, soft and even-grained, from a waxed paper bag on the counter, Wonder Bread or Pepperidge Farm or the local bakery's version. It went into the slots and the lever went down with a satisfying mechanical click, and then you waited, which was the correct thing to do. You waited with the smell of the toasting bread joining the bacon and the coffee in the kitchen air, adding its particular dry sweetness, its faint smoke, its promise of crispness and butter. When the toast popped up, it was with a suddenness that still surprised you, even though you were standing right there waiting for it. that mechanical spring, the two golden brown slices appearing from the slots, the immediate release of heat and smell. The butter went on while the toast was still hot enough to melt it immediately. A swipe across the surface that turned the solid butter to a spreading gleam, pooling slightly at the edges, soaking in at the center, and the smell of melted butter on toast is in a category of smells that requires no description, because anyone who has experienced it holds it in their body already and does not need it. Explained. Then, the jam. Welch's grape jelly in the small glass jar, or Smucker's strawberry preserves, the jar with the gingham pattern lid label, or the homemade stuff in a mason jar, sealed with paraffin wax, if yours was a family that made preserves in August and lined them up on the pantry shelf. The jam went on with a table knife, enough to cover the butter, and the combination of the hot toast and the cold butter now melted, and the sweet jam pressed against your teeth when you bit down, was something so specific and so complete that it is almost its own category of sensation, not just taste. An experience. A small, complete, perfectly ordinary experience that happened every morning and accumulated over a childhood into something that is now, decades later, almost sacred in memory. Who made breakfast in your house? And was it always the same person? In most American homes of the 1960s, the answer is already forming in your mind. She made it. Your mother made it. Made it every weekday morning without exception, and most weekend mornings as well. Different on the weekends. More time, more food, pancakes perhaps, or French toast, but still her, still the kitchen, still the smell that traveled through the house and found you where you slept. There are homes, of course, where the father cooked breakfast on weekends with a specific flair, with the extra butter and the slightly more generous portions that came from someone who didn't do it every day and was therefore making a small occasion of it. There are homes where a grandmother was in the kitchen before anyone else, moving through the morning with the unhurried authority of someone who had been doing this since before your parents were born. But in the most common 1960s American domestic arrangement, it was the mother, and she did it without anyone remarking on it, which is a thing that deserves to be remarked on now. She set her alarm for 6, or was awake already before the alarm, and came to the kitchen in the dark of an October morning, or the first gray light of a June morning, and she started the percolator, and she got out the bacon, and she did all of it, before anyone else in the house had opened their eyes. It was not discussed, it was not scheduled, it was simply what happened every morning, which made it part of the reliable structure of the world. The part of the world that a child experiences as permanent and necessary, as fixed as gravity, as certain as the sun. You didn't know then that you were tasting something you would never quite taste again. The orange juice was squeezed by hand. In many houses, every morning, oranges were halved on the cutting board, the wooden one, stained with years of juice, and pressed on the glass or ceramic juicer, the one with the ridged dome and the channel around the rim that caught the juice and directed it toward the spout and into the pitcher below. It was a physical operation. It required the pressing of a palm, the turning of the orange half, the feel of juice running cold and slightly sticky over the hand, the smell of fresh orange released with sudden intensity at the first press, citrus so sharp and real that it cut through the bacon and the coffee and the toast and asserted itself absolutely. That smell, that specific, unsweetened, slightly bitter smell of a fresh orange halved and pressed, the essential oil from the rind releasing into the air. Some mornings it was frozen concentrate, the small cardboard can from the freezer, the orange ring printed on it, the can opener used to open both ends, the frozen cylinder tipped into the glass pitcher, the 3 cans of cold water added and stirred with a long spoon until the concentrate dissolved. The result was good. It was cold and sweet and orange, and it was drunk by a generation of American children who knew no other version of orange juice and were entirely satisfied with it. But the fresh squeezed was something else. You could taste the difference immediately. The slight bitterness of the fresh juice that the concentrate sweetened away, the texture that was not quite smooth, the pulp that some families strained and some did not. And if yours was a family that did not strain it, you drank the pulp without complaint, because that was orange juice. That was how it tasted. That was the morning. The juice glass was small, not the large tumbler of later eras. A small, Thick bottom glass, 6 ounces, cold enough that it was difficult to hold for long, and the juice inside was cold enough to feel like a shock to a mouth accustomed to the warm kitchen air. You drank it first, usually, before the food, before the coffee, which you were too young for. The juice first, with both hands around the glass, the cold of it against your palms, the sharp sweetness of it on your tongue, and the morning beginning in your body. The newspaper was on the table. Your father had brought it in from the front step, or it had been pushed through the mail slot in some houses, and it sat folded beside his place, or he had already opened it, the large broadsheet spread across his side of the table, his coffee cup somewhere among the pages, his attention divided between the news and the breakfast and the radio and the children, the morning requiring a kind of practiced inattention that was its own form of presence. He was there. He was at the table. The newspaper was a prop, almost, a way of being in the kitchen in the morning without requiring conversation, without demanding engagement from anyone. A social permission to be quietly adjacent to the family while they assembled for the day. Some fathers talked at breakfast. Some were quiet, newspaper-focused, coffee-dependent, not quite present until the second cup. You know which kind yours was. The cereal was on the table in some households alongside the cooked food, available for the children who were faster than the eggs, or who preferred the cereal, or who were on the abbreviated school morning schedule that didn't accommodate the full sit-down with eggs and toast. Cheerios in the yellow box, cornflakes in the red and white. Wheaties, breakfast of champions, with the athlete on the box that changed with the sporting season. Shredded wheat in the waxed inner package, the large biscuits that had to be broken in the bowl and softened with milk. The whole milk arrived in glass bottles, delivered to the door in many households in the early 60s, a practice that was fading by the middle of the decade as the supermarket took over the dairy relationship. Whole milk, not 2%, not skim, not any of the reduced fat variations that came later. Whole milk, cream-colored at the top of the bottle where the cream had risen. And if your mother didn't shake the bottle first, or if you were the one who got there first and poured without shaking, the first pour was cream, thick and yellow, and the cereal floated in something richer than milk, and this was fine. This was normal. This was simply what milk was. The glass bottle, cool and heavy, with a cardboard cap that you pressed in with a thumb to open. The sound of the cream-top cap giving way. Cream of wheat on winter mornings. This is its own category of memory. The canister with the chef on it, a black chef, a drawing that would be reconsidered in later decades, but was, in the 1960s kitchen, simply the cream of wheat canister. As familiar as any kitchen object, and the preparation was different from anything else on the breakfast table, requiring a constant stir over medium heat to prevent lumping, resulting in a smooth, pale, porridge-like dish that was served in a bowl with a pat of butter melting into the center, and brown sugar sprinkled over the top, and milk poured around the edges, and eaten with a spoon in the warmth of a winter kitchen, when the cold outside the window was a fact of the morning, and the cream of wheat was the answer to it. Now, the thing that sat in the middle of the table, it wasn't the butter dish. Though the butter dish was always there, a small covered dish, ceramic or pressed glass, with a stick of butter inside, slightly soft from the counter warmth, taken from the refrigerator 10 minutes before the meal, so it would spread instead of tearing the toast. It wasn't the salt and pepper shakers, though those were constants as well, ceramic matched sets in most houses, or the glass ones with the aluminum tops, always together, always within reach. It was the syrup bottle, log cabin syrup, in the tin shaped like a log cabin, the little metal cabin with the chimney for the cap. The syrup inside amber and sweet and almost but not quite maple, a version of maple that was mostly corn syrup and maple flavoring and was entirely its own thing, occupying a category alongside but separate from real Vermont maple syrup, which was expensive and reserved for special occasions in most households. Or Mrs. Butterworth's, the amber glass bottle shaped like a stout woman in an apron, the syrup pouring from her head. The bottle warm to the touch if it had been near the stove. These were the constants. They sat in the middle of the table every morning, not just on pancake mornings. They were there because someone might want them. They were part of the table's standing offer. That bottle in the center of the table, log cabin, Mrs. Butterworth's, whatever yours was, is the thing every family had and nobody thought about. It was just there, until it wasn't. And now you're thinking about exactly which one sat on your table, in what position, whether it had a ring of dried syrup on its cap that your mother occasionally wiped with a damp cloth and replaced. You know exactly which one it was. The weekend breakfast was a different creature entirely. The Saturday or Sunday morning of a 1960s American household operated under different rules. The alarm was not set. The first sounds from the kitchen came later, and the pace of them was slower, more exploratory, less driven by the school bus schedule. And the food that emerged was larger, more ambitious, more willing to take time and attention. Pancakes, made from scratch in most kitchens, occasionally from Aunt Jemima or Bisquick mix when time or energy was limited, poured onto a hot greased griddle in rounds that spread to the edge of themselves and bubbled at the surface as they cooked, the bubbles appearing first at the edges, then moving toward the center, and when the bubbles in the center of the pancake were opening and staying open, that was the signal. Time to flip. Not before. The underside should be golden, a pale, warm brown that transferred its color to the plate through the syrup and butter, a stack of 3, 4, 5, depending on the appetite. The syrup went on warm. In some households, heated briefly in a small saucepan until it poured more easily, a small luxury that made the difference between syrup that sat on top of the pancake and syrup that soaked in. Or it went on cold, poured generously. The coldness of it a contrast to the heat of the pancakes that was entirely correct. The butter melted immediately against the hot surface, and the syrup mixed with the butter in the pools between the layers of pancakes. And the first bite through all the layers, butter, syrup, soft pancake interior, slightly crisp exterior, was a thing that a person ate and forgot they were eating because it was simply the standard of what breakfast could be on a morning when there was no hurry. French toast was its own institution. Eggs beaten with milk and a pour of vanilla extract, though not all recipes used vanilla, and some families used cinnamon instead, and some used both, and some used neither. Believing that the egg and the milk and the bread were sufficient without further embellishment, the bread dipped in this batter until it was saturated, then laid in the buttered skillet where it fried in the egg coating, the exterior going golden and slightly crisp, while the interior remained soft and custardy. Powdered sugar on top in many households, or syrup, or jam, or all three. On a generous Saturday morning when no one was going anywhere and seconds were already anticipated. And biscuits in households where the Southern tradition held, and grits alongside them, and country ham rather than the streaky bacon of the Northern or Midwestern table. The biscuit of a 1960s Southern kitchen was not a refrigerated canned product. It was cut from dough that had been made with lard or shortening, worked into flour with the fingertips until the mixture had the right crumb, just barely moistened with buttermilk, turned out on a floured surface, and cut with the biscuit cutter that had probably been in the family since before the war. They baked in a hot oven and came out with a brown top and a pale, tender pull-apart interior that was designed by its nature to be split and buttered while still steaming, the butter going in immediately, the biscuit giving slightly under the press of the knife. In Pennsylvania, it was scrapple. In Jewish households in the cities, it was bagels, often bakery fresh, with cream cheese or with lox, if that was a tradition in the household. The smoked salmon laying in thin, translucent sheets over the cream cheese, the whole thing assembled without cooking on a plate beside a glass of juice. A different relationship with breakfast entirely. No skillet, no stove, no sizzle, but its own completeness, its own morning ritual of assembly and repetition and shared expectation. In the Southwest, flour tortillas, warm from the comal, made by hand in many households, the tortilla press or the rolling pin. The dough made the evening before or the morning of, cooked on the dry griddle until they blistered slightly and smelled of warm masa. Eaten with eggs, scrambled with onion and jalapeno, and the particular morning heat of a Texas or New Mexico kitchen, where the breakfast table was in the window and the sun was already up at 6, and the day was going to be warm before it was barely started. Every region of America ate breakfast in the morning of the 1960s, and every region understood it differently, and yet every version of it shared the same essential quality. It was cooked, it was made by someone who had gotten up early enough to make it, using things they had stocked in the kitchen with the specific intention of making breakfast, following habits that were as natural as sleeping and as necessary as the day itself. The percolator sound deepened around the 15-minute mark. If you were paying attention, and on a slow Saturday morning, you might be sitting at the table in your pajamas with nothing to hurry toward, you could hear it change. The early part of the sound was quick and eager, the water cycling rapidly, the coffee still thin. Then it slowed. The sound became more deliberate, each knock of the coffee against the glass knob more considered, as if the percolator itself knew it was almost done and was taking its time with the last few minutes. And then your mother or your father would reach over and turn the burner down to the lowest setting, and the percolator would slow further, and the coffee would sit and deepen, and in another 2 minutes it was ready. The coffee cup was ceramic, heavy, not delicate, a diner-style mug in many homes, thick-walled and substantial, designed to retain heat and to survive the washing of many years, chip-proof in a practical sense, if not entirely chip-proof in practice. The handle was wide enough for a full hand. When your father lifted it, or when you watched him lift it, because you were still too young for coffee in the early years of the decade, though by the late 60s a teenager might have a cup, especially with a great deal of milk and sugar, when he lifted it with both hands wrapped around it in the morning cold, the steam rising from the dark surface, and he held it without drinking for a moment, just held it. Just let the warmth come through the ceramic into his palms. That was something. That was a small human moment that was repeated in millions of kitchens every morning, and was so common that it was invisible and is now, because it is gone. The family was all at the table by 7 or 7:15, or most of them. The teenager might not appear until the last possible minute, sliding into a chair and accepting whatever was left without complaint, or with exactly the complaint appropriate to a teenager who has slept until the last possible moment and is now resentful of time. The younger children were reliably present, reliably hungry, already talking. The father with his newspaper, the mother between the table and the stove, carrying plates, refilling cups, sitting down and standing up again, because there was always something else needed, the butter dish emptied, the toast gone, a glass of milk required by the smallest one, a small argument over the last piece of bacon. This happened. You know it happened in your house, or in some version of your house. The last 2 strips in the pan, and the question of who got them, the implicit negotiation of a family that had done this so many times that the negotiation had its own established patterns, its outcomes largely predictable, a parent intervening. A knowing look exchanged across the table, a piece of bacon arriving on a plate that had not expected it, from a hand that had made a decision without announcing it. This is love. This is ordinary, unremarkable, daily love expressed through a strip of bacon in the morning before school, and no one called it love, no one named it, because it was simply what happened at the table. The morning prayer, in households where it was practiced, was brief. A bowed head. A few words, grace before the meal, spoken quickly on weekdays because the bus was coming, spoken more fully on Sundays, with more intention, the food cooling slightly while the words were said, and then the response. And the silverware lifting, and the morning beginning in full. What did your family's breakfast table look like on a weekday morning? Close your eyes for a moment if you want to. There is no hurry. This is a 1960s morning, and the pace of a 1960s morning was different from the pace of any morning that came after it, which is perhaps the thing that no food or appliance can replicate. The time. The unhurried quality of a morning in which the school bus came at 8:15 and breakfast was served at 7, and in between those 2 fixed points was a long stretch of kitchen time, of sitting and eating and listening to the radio, of having no phone to look at, and no news feed to scroll, and nothing to do with your hands, except hold the toast and watch the steam rise from your cocoa, and listen to your mother's footsteps between the stove and the table. Nobody called it peace. It was just breakfast, the cocoa. This deserves its own moment. Not the hot cocoa of a packet mixed with hot water that came later, This was cocoa made on the stove. A tablespoon of Hershey's cocoa powder stirred into a paste with sugar and a little cold milk in the saucepan first, to prevent lumps. Then the rest of the milk added and the heat raised slowly, your mother watching and stirring, and the cocoa darkening and thickening and sending up a chocolate milk steam that was entirely different from the factory version, poured into the ceramic cup, too hot to drink immediately, held while it cooled. And the cooling of it was not a frustration, but a pace, a small enforced stillness in the morning, a reason to sit at the table a little longer, the cup warm in your hands. Oatmeal in winter, real oatmeal. The round cardboard canister with the Quaker man on it. The rolled oats stirred into boiling water with a little salt and cooked slowly until they thickened. Then served in a bowl with a lump of butter disappearing into the center, and brown sugar, and a pour of whole milk around the edges, and sometimes raisins if you were the sort of family that did raisins, and always eaten while it was still warm. Because oatmeal that has gone cold is a different food entirely. On a February morning in Ohio, or Michigan, or Vermont, with the wind pushing at the kitchen window, and the linoleum cold underfoot and school 2 hours away, oatmeal was the correct response to the world, and everyone knew it. The bacon smell had changed by now, after the initial high sizzle of the frying. After the strips were done and resting on the paper towel that absorbed the excess fat. Paper towels were newer to American kitchens in the early 60s, and some households still used newspaper for this, spreading a few pages on the counter and laying the cooked bacon across them. After all of that, the smell that remained in the kitchen was softer, more integrated. The fat and the smoke and the salt having become part of the kitchen air itself rather than an announcement. It mixed now with the coffee smell and the toast and the orange and the cocoa, and the kitchen had become a composite of all of it. A single complex smell that belonged to that time and that house and those people and no other combination of things in the world. This is the smell that finds you now, decades later, not in any kitchen you currently occupy, but in a memory, or on a cool October morning when someone nearby is frying bacon, or when you walk past a diner and the exhaust vent is working and the smell comes out, and it is 1964 for 1 full second before the world reasserts itself. The last piece of toast. The last swallow of orange juice, which had warmed slightly in the glass and tasted different from the first cold swallow of the morning, the sugar more present now, the sharpness softer. The juice at the bottom of the glass where the pulp had settled, the sound of chairs pushed back, the gathering of plates. Your mother at the sink, with the water running, already washing the cast iron skillet, which required only hot water and a cloth, never soap. You don't use soap on cast iron, and if you grew up in a household with cast iron, you learned this early and held it for life. Your father folded the newspaper and left it on the table for your mother to read later. He put on his coat in the hallway, checked his watch, said something brief and ordinary. Be good today, have a good day. The formulas of departure that were the same every morning because they were supposed to be the same, because the same was the point. Because a morning departure that went the same way it always did meant the world was still in order and you could count on things. The bus came. You put on your coat over the good clothes your mother had laid out the night before. You picked up your lunchbox, metal, with the thermos inside that had been filled with more cocoa or with milk, depending on the season, and you went to the door, and the kitchen was behind you, warm and smelling of everything that had happened in it that morning, and you didn't look back because you were going to school and the morning was finished. But the kitchen stayed. Your mother was in it. She would be in it all day, moving through its particular warm world, and it would smell of the morning's cooking for hours. And when you came home in the afternoon and opened the back door, the first thing you would smell was the remnant of the breakfast. The ghost of the bacon and the coffee and the toast that had happened 12 hours before and still lived in the kitchen air like a kind of memory the house kept on your behalf. When was the last time you squeezed an orange by hand or heard a percolator bubble and just sat there with no place to rush to? It ended gradually. These things always end gradually. The percolator was replaced by the drip coffee maker, the Mr. Coffee machine that appeared in the early 70s. Automatic, programmable eventually, producing a consistent cup without supervision, without the watching and the timing and the visual check of the glass knob. Practical, faster, quieter. The sound it made was different. It was fine. But it was not the percolator. The thick-cut bacon from the butcher gave way to the cellophane package from the supermarket. Not worse, necessarily, but different. A different transaction, a different relationship with the food, a different morning. The cast-iron skillet moved to the back of the cabinet as non-stick pans appeared, easier to clean, lighter to lift, requiring no seasoning, producing no richness of accumulated cooking history in their surface because they had no history. They were new. They were this year's pan. The old skillet went to the attic or to a grandchild who kept it because they understood, somehow, that it was worth keeping. The Formica table in some homes was replaced by wood. In others, it stayed and became vintage, became a piece of something, became the thing people now seek out at estate sales. The chrome-edged boomerang pattern table that once held a family's breakfast every morning for 15 years and now sits in a carefully decorated kitchen as an object of nostalgic intention. The kitchen radio gave way to television. The small set moved to the kitchen counter in the early 70s. The morning news now visual. The faces of anchors replacing the voices of disc jockeys and farm reporters. The passive watching, replacing the half-listening that had allowed the morning to be primarily about the food and the family rather than the broadcast. And gradually, year by year, convenience by convenience, the cooked breakfast receded. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but the mornings shortened. Both parents were working, in many households, by the early 70s. The time between waking and leaving contracted. The food that could be made in the time available contracted with it. Cereal from a box, eaten standing at the counter. A piece of toast, held in the hand, going out the door. The percolator replaced by instant coffee, then by the drive-through cup, then by whatever the current era's version of morning speed is. The orange juice became a carton in the refrigerator, then a plastic bottle, then an option rather than a daily presence. The breakfast that had been a half-hour event, a fixed point of family assembly, a small daily ceremony of warmth and provision, became a personal, individual, hurried transaction. Not wrong, not worse, maybe, by some measures, but different, deeply, fundamentally different in what it said about the morning, and about the people in it, and about the understanding of what the first meal of the day was for. The percolator is almost silent now. You can still find one at an estate sale, or in the back of a kitchen cabinet, in the house of someone very old, or in an antique store, where it sits next to the chrome-edged Formica table and the glass syrup bottle and the ceramic coffee mugs with their thick walls and their slightly chipped rims. Together they make a still life of a morning that happened daily for a decade and a half, and then receded into memory. The smell of the bacon is still there in the memory. You can get it back sometimes. A diner at 7 in the morning. A Saturday when you decide to cook. A moment when someone else is making breakfast in the next room and the smell comes to find you the way it always came, traveling through the house, arriving before the food, saying something is happening. Come toward it. The percolator sound is in the body. It comes back in quiet moments. Talk, talk, talk. The sound of readiness. The sound of someone thinking about you before you woke up. The cool Formica surface under your palms at the kitchen table in 1965. The small glass of orange juice. The crunch of the first bite of toast. Your mother at the stove with her back to you. The spatula in her hand. The radio on low. No one said it was special, it just was. That was your childhood. That was your mother. That was peace. What did your family's breakfast table look like on a weekday morning? Who made breakfast in your house? And when was the last time you squeezed an orange by hand and just sat there with nowhere to rush to? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to sit at the table with you.